Why a training program? Journalism is among the most powerful tools for social justice, particularly in the global fight against gender-based violence. Journalists have the power to amplify the voices of women, girls, and gender-diverse people, to shed light on the forms of violence that target them, and to help communities worldwide address the harmful social norms that underpin gender inequality and gender-based violence.
Deciding what's a story is probably the hardest part of the day, right? Because kind of everything's a story. You can make anything a story. Lots of things are interesting. Lots of people are interesting. How are we filtering it out? For me, it was always, is it an issue of social justice, social policy? Does it reflect my community back? Is this a systemic problem or is this a one-off? You know, that sort of context piece and making sure I gave the context. But yeah, that's an ongoing, everyday, what is this a story? And harder now with that incremental, am I still up at midnight posting the next thing that's happening in this story, or is my clock off now? You know, but I need this next piece to give that point of view. I don't want to wait another 10 hours to give that. I better just constant.
We don't really receive any specific training for interviewing somebody who's a victim of gender-based violence. But to put that in context, we don't really receive any specific training about interviewing any specific person. When you're hired as a reporter at a newspaper, the general expectation is that you can walk into any situation, no matter how delicate, and be able to, talk to people, gather information, package it in an understandable way, and present it to the reader.
I don't think any media outlet has rules or guidelines for how to interview trauma victims. You kind of learn by doing. Which is really a bad way of going about it.
We do need training and that sort of thing on interviewing people who have been through dramatic situations. But I think that a lot of the stuff that I did was sort of intuition based on clearly this guy doesn't want to talk about this, so we'll just move on. And clearly he wants to talk about this, so I'll just ask, even if I'm not going to use it. We're going to let this poor man whose daughter was just murdered talk.
One of the tenets of journalism is do no harm. Right? I don't want to make your situation worse by asking an inappropriate question, by making you feel uncomfortable, by you thinking that I'm being voyeuristic or sensationalistic. How can I make sure I do no harm to you? And I think a book that would help me do no harm would make me sleep better at night.
Through this training program, we aim to promote gender equality and diversity in news media content, enhance news media capacity to appropriately and responsibly address gender-based violence, and increase the representation of women and gender-diverse people as experts and leaders in news media. In 2020, the International Women's Media Foundation released a report on women's representation in the media titled "The Missing Perspectives of Women in News," which furthered the knowledge of existing issues around reporting women's issues in traditional and social media, particularly regarding gender-based violence. Recent years have seen a notable surge in news media coverage of gender-based violence, from high-profile cases involving public figures to frequent media releases from police regarding unsolved incidents of sexual assault, and all too often, femicide. While increased media attention has driven a growing public dialogue on this issue, the nature of media reporting on the subject has unfortunately often been problematic in several regards, including sensationalism, inaccurate and inappropriate vocabulary, victim-blaming language, coverage that is not representative of diverse populations, and a failure to contextualize gender-based violence as a wider societal issue rather than a string of isolated incidents.
The simple act of watching a newscast, reading a news article or a magazine article, or looking at something posted on social media is an exercise in evaluation, and we're not taught how to do that.
The media has a huge impact and influence on forming public opinion. How do we decide? How do we know what's going on in the world unless we're paying attention to the media? There are many times when I look at a headline and, first of all, I might not know exactly what the story is. And so often I'm disappointed when I read the story because it isn't related or it doesn't seem to be related to the headline. So I think it's extremely important that the media and journalists take a hard look at what they're putting in a headline, because that might be the only thing we're looking at. But I think we're so influenced by the headline because we may not be reading more.
Lori DuPont's murder was hands down the most important story that I ever did. It meant so much to me. I think the main problem in the media coverage, and this happens a lot, is she became the slain nurse, the murdered nurse. That always really, really bothered me, in the same way that we would see, murdered prostitute, or, that this person is more than just the title. And the other thing that bothered me was actually from an audience perspective. I think people in Ontario should know her name. I think she should be on a flag. I think she should be on a coin. I don't care what it is. But her case had laws changed so that women are safer in workplaces. And nobody knows her name. Now, it was a national story, but it didn't get beyond the sensational part. It holds people's interest in that moment. And then how do you keep them sustained in the issues rather than just this sensational case? That's I don't think we've ever been able to do that. How come her name isn't known?
With our ability to hyperlink within stories, since most people are reading online, how do you use that to provide more information? So we have a very short piece, but there are ways to then say, if for somebody who wants more information, this story is reporting on uh, domestic violence within this community. For more information, here you go. Here's some more resources for people to go to. We need to be able to get that extra information and to know it's coming from reliable sources, because so much of what we are exposed to is very unreliable, and we don't necessarily know it.
Our program is focused on developing resources to promote more accurate and responsible reporting. Through education, it is hoped that the way the media covers these events can begin to be reframed. This program will address two key issues. Number one, women and gender-diverse people are currently underrepresented in news media. And number two, gender-based violence is often underreported or poorly reported in news media. Accurate and sensitive media coverage can help survivors, at-risk individuals, and their communities find available resources and services that can provide help. That fact is so important that I'm going to say it again. Accurate and sensitive media coverage can help survivors, at-risk individuals, and their communities find available resources and services that can provide help. This should be a priority. Covering these often horrific stories can help save lives. It can also help spotlight and address harmful social and gender norms and practices that enable and cause gender-based violence. No matter the issue being discussed, media plays an important role, arguably the most important role, in forming public opinion. And in forming public opinion, there is an opportunity to influence public policy.
It's hard to teach about gendered violence, covering gendered violence issues, because you can't talk in a journalism program about covering every single kind of story there is. So you can use examples. And I think one thread that I find is really important to talk about and hammer home is this idea of being compassionate. Is that if it's not somebody that I voted for, so if it's not the prime minister or the premier or the mayor or the chief of police or whatever, who I have to challenge, I have every right to challenge and ask tough questions. But if it's the victim or survivor of a crime, I'm going to do everything from book more time to take more time with them, give them more control over the interview, to say, if I ask a question you don't want to answer, tell me I don't want to answer that question. Give them the power, right?
I think there's a poor assumption that's usually made that the victims of gender-based violence, particularly when we're talking about women, must have therefore engaged in what now gets described in police lingo as high-risk behavior. So sex trade, exotic dancing, drug use, hanging around the wrong neighborhood. I have met women who absolutely would fall into those categories. On the other hand, I have met well-educated, wealthy women, professional women who don't check any of those boxes, who nonetheless still had to escape an abusive situation and still had to leave everything behind and still has to deal with all that. So not going into those things with assumptions about who these people are or what's happened to them is the first thing. Secondly, let those people tell their stories. Don't assume you know it, because you probably don't. And then I think ultimately and this is not, and I don't know how you would prescribe this to a journalist. You have to try to be kind, and you have to respect absolutely that they have welcomed you into their sort of psychological or emotional space to talk about something that's very hard for them to talk, and you are an intruder. You may be a kind intruder, you may be an intruder with the best, you are an intruder nonetheless. And so you have to respect that. And you have to kind of let them move at their own pace. Because if you don't, that whole delicate house of cards will blow apart pretty fast.
Having the training in the workplace, so you're learning as you're doing, is going to make those stories that you're doing in the moment better and be a learning opportunity. So those stories that matter, obviously, if you're covering them, they matter. There's been a decision that they matter. And when you're a reporter, usually you care a lot that you do a really good job on stories that matter. So to me, it has to be in the workplace, because looking at how an old story was covered is helpful, maybe, but it's much more helpful in the moment when I'm covering this story right now, because this story is really important to me and I want to get it right.
Key takeaways. Media plays a critical role in educating the public and, by doing so, potentially influencing public opinion and policy. There is a need for media coverage of the broader sociological, historical, and economic contexts of gender-based violence and gendered issues.